So let's get started. So welcome. The camera's on you, right? Okay. So welcome. My name is Paul Cheng. I work at graduate school, and I'm happy to be giving this workshop today about how to tell a story about your research. As you can see, some of the sorts of things on the ways in which this workshop can be useful, not only to help you design, say, your 3-minute thesis, proposal, or presentation, but also thinking about more popular writing as well as podcasting. So I'm hoping that this workshop will be useful in a variety of ways, because I think storytelling is a way to perhaps capture the essence of your research. Okay. So to begin, just a few of the kinds of outcomes and objectives, just 2 so far today. Hoping you can actually help use this workshop to identify some common problems you may have when describing your research, as well as applying what are called the success principles to tell a story about your research. And the principles I'm going to talk about today are from this book called Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. It's been out for a while. But the success principles is actually an acronym of simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional, and stories to help you with your presentations or your pitches in general. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today. But since this is a live workshop, I do want to ask if there are any particular issues or topics you make sure that you want me to cover for today. Anyone? I don't believe we have any live participants. Didn't expect that. Okay. So what I want to do is first talk a little bit about why stories. And so this was an experiment done back in 1944, very famous psychology experiment for Titor and Marianne Simmel. And basically they showed this video to folks. And so I'm going to show you the video. And they asked people to describe what was happening. So, oops. Play. Okay. So this is the actual video itself. Okay. So you saw this, basically this video of triangle, large triangle, small triangle, and a circle. Describe what happened. How would you describe what happened?
The big triangle is chasing the small triangle and the circles.
Okay.
And yeah, like they're escaping, even though they're just triangle and a circle. Yeah.
Okay, they're escaping. And what else? What else do you see? Do you have to describe that?
So the smaller circle went inside of the larger rectangle and enclosed themselves within that rectangle while the larger triangle was chasing or hitting, I don't know if it was chasing or hitting at him, but yeah, to me, it seemed like it was hitting at the smaller triangle until the smaller triangle was able to then to the big triangle, went back to the rectangle to go for the circle, it seemed like. Okay. And then the smaller triangle came to, like, he or she, whatever, wanted to rescue the circle. And then eventually the circle got out. And then they both were together, and the larger triangle came out and started chasing them. And then, yeah, they disappeared together. The circle and the smaller triangle. And the big triangle was left there on the screen. I can remember.
Sure. Maya, thoughts?
To me, the big triangle seemed aggressive.
Okay.
We describe it as being aggressive towards the little triangle, and the rectangle broke open and left the little circle.
So it's interesting because they showed this to, I think, 34 undergraduate women. And of the 34, only one person described the action almost entirely in geometric shapes. The other 33 basically described a story. So typically they attributed human-like or animal kind of things to it. So they called it either birds or people. Typically they described the actions in words like jealousy, rage, and anger, and frustration. So it's a really interesting way in which basically we have these shapes which are just moving around, and we ascribe actions and behaviors and reasons and rationales to them. And so again, one of the reasons why stories is that they're almost natural. We have this kind of almost intrinsic, innate kind of cognitive capacity to attribute reason to basically shapes that are moving on the screen. Okay. So the other reason of why stories, and I want to sort of do this by actually telling you a story to give you this example. There's a person woke up in the morning, but it was very, very quiet. Got up out of bed, no noise. It was very, very quiet. Put his feet on the floor, walked across the room, went downstairs. It was still very, very quiet. So I've just told you the beginning of a story where absolutely nothing happens, but I can see by the looks in your face that you're utterly engaged in a trance, where we have, again, nothing happening in this story. And so stories are incredibly engaging. And the point of this story is that it's not the what necessarily in terms of what's happening, because nothing is happening in this story, but it's the how and the why. Why is it so quiet? Okay, so remembering that stories don't necessarily have to be about the what, and oftentimes in your research, right, if you're in the midst of your research, the what may still be undetermined, right? But thinking about the how and the why questions can be equally engaging when you're writing your story or you're composing a story about your research, okay? And in fact, when we think about it, our research is never done, right? We always have the next project, and we're always trying to get funding for it, or we're trying to convince an editor or whatever to publish or fund our stories, right? And so it's thinking about the how and the why as equally important as the what, okay? So, all right, so oftentimes, however, if they are so, say, natural or so engaging, why do we have so much trouble when people ask us the question, before. So what I'd like you to do is just pair up to somebody, preferably somebody you don't know or don't know well, and basically answer one of these questions. So tell me about your research, or so what do you work on? Okay, so I'd just like you to spend a few minutes just pairing up, answering one of those questions, okay? So pair up.
There.
Sure.
Great.
Move this just a little closer to you. They're pretty big, yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about your research.
We do, but this one picks people up pretty well, and especially when you ask people to participate, then we can hear them fine.
Well, currently I'm working on it's focused on like looking at school restructuring, school closures, particularly in places like Chicago, and looking at the lived experiences of those who have been impacted by school closures or school restructuring. So that's where schools are either completely shut down, or they have been transitioned over where all of the teaching staff or the teaching staff administrators have been shifted, but students still living there. But my research is mostly focused on the school that has experienced or is currently about to experience school closure. Yeah. In the school, from the literature, and what has been shared is that schools have been are closing because of under-enrollment or underperforming schools. But there's also another literature that talks about how that's not all there is to the story, but that there has been historical discrimination that has happened within those community areas.
So take another minute or so to wrap up.
I was going to ask what guys were
I'll let you share.
like were students not responding well?
Take another minute or so to wrap up, and then switch.
Did you feel like students were not responding to
actual humans, like
About another minute or so to wrap up. Another minute or so to wrap up.
so that then it can be transferred.
when you
over
went
to,
into your
the
research?
robot,
Was
the
there
robots, we can
evidence
see how they will then be able
like
to.
students weren't really-
Oh,
they were not doing cooperative?
mainly, so not necessarily maybe, I don't know, maybe not just the why, but more so like maybe the why, but from the students and the teachers' perspective who are in those schools. Yeah. And not necessarily focusing just on why those schools closed, so like the impact that they had on those who were.
Okay, so wrapping up.
And the community. Yeah.
just like to ask. So how did it go?
Oh.
Okay. All right. Good.
We only got to one.
You only got to one.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So oftentimes, I'm not going to say that this is what happened in your conversations, but oftentimes the kind of typical pattern that when people talk about their research is something that looks like this. So it's basically my research is about, and they keep talking and talking and talking and talking, talking some more and talking some more and talking some more. Okay. And
It's to end over there.
I missed it. And the reason this happens is it's oftentimes just a string of information, a string of facts, okay? And there's no real causal connection for the listener. It's just a string of just information, almost a kind of a brain dump of what's in your head. And the reason that this happens is because we're oftentimes stuck in the kind of lit review mode, okay? So, and what I mean by lit review is just, okay, so I pulled this from my website called Library Guide USC, blah, blah, blah. So you know it's official, legit, because it's written by a library. So the purpose of a lit review, placing each work in context, describing the relationships to each work, identifying new ways to interpret, blah, 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 blah. And the most important, to locate your own research within the context of existing literature, okay? So as graduate students, you're often put in a situation where you often feel like you don't know enough. And so what you proceed to do when you talk about your research is to fall into lit review mode and describe the entire field or your topic to the person who's listening, okay? And you need to do this because you need to establish your own unique contribution to the literature, right? And so before you can even do that, you need to talk about the literature again and again and again, okay? The problem is that your listener or the audience, especially if they're non-specialist audience, say in like a 3-minute thesis or podcasting, they just don't care. Not only do they just not care, that they don't have the kind of understanding or grasp of your field to make sense of it, okay? You're just giving them facts, again, of this and they have no way to place those facts or situate those facts in like a schema, framework, or structure. So it's not unlike you have, say, a cup and you're pouring water into the cup. Your cup only has a certain amount of limited capacity. If you keep pouring water into it, it'll just spill out, right? And so that's what in some ways you're doing for your audience, your listener. You're just giving them undigested facts, right? Because again, they don't have the framework or understanding to make sense of those facts, okay? So what can you do? So you can do it by focusing on the following questions. And this is just very simple. The purpose of my research is, blank, and what could people do with your research 10, 20 years from now? Okay. And so thinking about those, just a couple of more specific things. How does your research affect anyone outside your department? Why should they know this? And of course, in short, the so what question, right? Okay, so I'd like you to take just a few minutes answering those top 2 questions. The purpose of my research is, fill in the blank. And what could people do with your research 10, 20 years from now? Okay, so again, if your research may be very basic, right? So you're not working on the cure for cancer, but you could be working on a certain signaling process that could have implications for therapeutic use. Okay, so take a few minutes to answer these top 2 questions. And then again, think about it in the context of how your research affects people, say, outside of your department, why they should know this. And in short, you should be able to answer the so what question. So what? Who cares? Why should people care about what you do? Okay, so take a few minutes and addressing the top 2 questions in the context of 3 bullets. Okay, so again, a few minutes to work on that. So share your answers to the challenging questions.
Sure. So I did mine more on the improvements of this year.
Okay.
Is to create communities for accuracy in order to build scale. I said, I should, how does your research affect sort of outside of your, I said, or why should they know this? Or wait, it's like, how is your research affect outside? Or no, sorry, what can people do to research to yeah. I said it can improve the experiences of the IPs and researchers. And well, they could improve the experiences of like hopefully the research that we that I would write for writing be used to create other experiences for people who are and how does your research affect?
Yeah,
I said that there are IPOC graduate writers in every department. Or not in every departments. And why should they know this? I would say so that they don't.
Sure.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe. So how goes my research of phase
That's part of the nature of graduate education. I went through it, so should you. That's part of the process.
Amazing.
You can't,
I mean, I know
you can't make omelets unless you break some eggs.
so that one is
Might
true.
be.
You can't make it, but yeah.
The last part, minimizing what
I would say
last part you
in
said.
short,
Oh.
question. So what it's about
This could also be
creating better retention states for graduates.
people are different psychological symptoms.
Yeah.
Make it so that their experiences are somehow acknowledged and supported. So that they don't drop out.
Does that mean like
And
Like what
is the
significance in, or like anybody, like, watch anybody when you or care about your work.
well, I would say that we should care about people dropping out because the state and taxpayers have invested a lot of money. So if you have a graduate student who's been given funding for like 4
feel bad.
years,
Feel the same way.
You've lost like $200,000 in education.
Take another minute or so to wrap up, another minute or so to wrap up. Before you start.
That's it.
Lost
The
income.
purpose of this is to understand
Lost,
what
what do you call it,
actually
return
experience,
on investment.
being at the school closures to like get a better insight into you know, what went on, what happened, what can we learn from that. And it's mainly like to capture those stories of histories from those who are no longer in the community, because also within that community, a lot of the houses have been removed, like a lot of the communities have moved to other villages too. So like the part of my project is about capturing those stories and those histories as well, that can then, and this goes into answering the second question, which is that then those stories and those histories can hopefully be used by communities or used by researchers to like learn about, you know, what went on in that area, and then or to connect with people who they probably didn't, you know about, or learn about their loved one that they, you know, never, that they hadn't met, you know, and so but it's there. Yeah, and I think for me, like, why should we know this? I think there's this common saying that history is always written by those who are like the victors, those who are the heroes, oftentimes the ones who get a chance to share and write about others. And so for me, it's like I have the opportunity with my work to write from another perspective that can illuminate their voices.
I feel like
within
that approach really
academia.
challenges the
That's it.
top-down model of
I feel like that why should
implications for like power dynamics in the classroom.
more. I feel like it should actually connect, even though it's not happening to us right now.
So let's wrap up. And
That's true.
so I'd like to actually offer a slight twist on this. So imagine you share with your partner. So I'd like you to think about, as you've listened, the following kind of thing in mind. So imagine you, as an individual, are in charge of awarding a $1 million research fellowship. Okay, so it's say $200,000 a year, 5 years, no strings attached, meaning you just give it to the other person and they can do whatever they want with the money. They can buy another house, they can buy a boat, they can blow it all on the lottery, you know, whatever, okay? No strings attached, okay? So the person in front of you that you just heard is the last of 10 nominees. And so just imagine that the person that's sitting in front of you just made their pitch, made their proposal. Okay. So, judging on what you've heard, would you be willing to give this person the fellowship? And if so, why? If not, why not?
You want us to talk amongst
Yeah.
ourselves?
Yeah.
I think like figuring out like the why for like the wider range is what I would say that would make me say like be hesitant to go with it, like with not knowing what is the larger.
You have an answer while
you are trying to figure it out. But the project itself.
So I would say it's a concern
ability to
because
like use that.
I don't have the data in front of me, but
transfer that over
based
to
on previous research that I know
robots that then
has been done, there's
will
been
have
a
some
lot
capabilities
that has shown
that
that
seems
graduate writers often, graduate writers
and then like figuring out
when
like
they don't find
how
support,
that like what about
often
robot,
have feelings of
being able to have the abilities of the
failure, or they have feelings isolation.
did not come through. Although I know you're from personal work and talking to people like girls do, but with
Yeah,
you
yeah,
exploring
more
it,
numbers
it didn't
of
necessarily come through like what,
IPOC
why would the
graduates
income go through or
realize that number. I guess I would want to think
what-
through it a little bit.
how would that enhance what we
It
already
makes me wonder
versus
what's
just having
happening with,
human eye makes it like that. Because it's like
It makes me
projects
wonder
that's going on where it's a
when
human
graduate
entity,
students aren't able to support the
and how they're seeing
where
it, but then
where
it's
they
like
going
with the
with
robotics. So it's like it seems like it's like two projects versus just one
the
project.
research that's out there has shown that there's also been a lot of violence enacted on graduate writers of color, doctoral writers. And so I think that's also part of that narrative of
Does it make sense, or you have questions about?
graduate
Yeah, I mean,
writers
like, I
coming
totally
in
understand,
and
like, two
really
parts. Like, one day, like, things like that was, because I feel like
programs.
technology, also, or like messes. Actually,
So I would say
project with you as well.
probably the same kind of thing, yes, funding.
If I focus
But maybe I would want to know a little bit more about like why cooperative, like why is cooperative like what other of the other models that exist, you know, why is this why is cooperative
And if you wanted to keep both, we'll just like really see how they're both
and then
connected. What
I
is
think like I was picturing like someone like my dad,
larger, like,
something like that. Or,
what would,
you know,
like,
my
it doesn't
dad,
have to be
like,
current answer, but like,
who very much
what
had that
would
approach
it then
of like
help us to do that?
top
Wasn't
down
able
and
to?
really thrive
Maybe that
more
would be
in
one.
learning
So what
approach.
would,
So what happens to
translate over to robotics, help us to do that? We didn't know
like that type of approach? Or you know, is there evidence to suggest that it isn't working? Because that's been a problem for so long. You know?
sounds good. Talk about
And then tell me more about like the things that includes being able to or figuring out how the image will work with the images, like what things will that help us better be able to do that?
I mean, like what is
Between the imaging and the images being able to interact with it.
so like what it's actually a lot of the nature books. Your eyes to then also or you were trying to figure out which one is the most interesting or the most like
Emotional,
like for the or like
why do you be invested in this?
what is the back to the next section or like your next direction. For example, using this table.
I feel like
Like also there's a big message
part of it is if you want
here
to
is
be
a
successful
slide.
as a scientist, okay, so if there's a slide, and you're going to do it, also,
So what is it about? You may go to one like because you're in the process of getting stuff so this kind of process is a process now and different areas of expertise are about the higher all of this as well as to you know like how they transfer from one scene to the other scene and use this process to for robotics like so
Not yet.
Like when you look at equity, it's
Okay.
focused on like racial
Alright, I
equity.
see. I should
Um,
kind of think of it
But I
like
think what
short.
you just explained actually connect both of them because you're looking at the human and how it impacts images so that then you can have with the robot.
Right.
But if you don't have that prior.
Yeah.
oh, when you were talking about equity,
Like
like
his-
questions,
yeah.
I was wondering if you want like
Okay.
give some
Okay.
color.
I should narrow
Are
it down.
are you
Yeah,
basing
thank you
that
so
on
much.
equity?
Yeah. So
Yeah. So I get the money or not?
Like how do you?
yeah. Well, for me, it's actually like I feel like the content and the most century yes, because like even though I might need to have like more details about how the whole process like more precisely. But other than that, I feel like it's
Oh, yeah,
actually,
okay.
like I could see the
I guess I was thinking
like how broadly the whole explore research might affect it. School and it actually affect like not just one regional
I was trying to think about like what some of the larger impacts are too.
I don't
In terms of how implementing these. And the reason why I asked about race was because I was thinking like one of the big questions is why are the students coming to the science classrooms? Like, are they not doing as well? Or how, you know, using models, but kind of like the top-down model lecture style, not cooperative-based model.
Well, I mean, like,
it might be
I don't, like, what it depends what you mean by learning.
Take another minute or so to wrap up. Another minute or so to wrap up.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was, so you know, you said that like I was able to, you were able to capture like
So
how
you do get a
it
whole
may
but it's not necessary.
have that large impact. Was there anything like that that made that click for you when that made you that? Or was
It's
it just
actually
your
the
own prior knowledge?
But I feel like
more,
the one you're saying about like why should I know this is
There
a
hasn't been a lot of segment done on that.
Actually,
Because the graduation rates remain somewhat comparable or may even show to be improving.
Okay, so when I
Yes, there isn't a distinction
Right.
or separating of the data and looking
Yeah.
at what are the interests, what are they coming in with, and then you know, they've been pushed out of certain disciplines.
and then actually that
So I would say, pardon.
it makes me like actually talking about history. It's like totally right. So yeah, I think. Oh, but I'm not sure that's for me. It's like I have like similarities. So everybody needs to understand.
All right, so let's get back together as lecture and talk a little bit about what you went
Thank
through.
you.
And if there was any kind of similarities you noticed in your comments or your feedback. So just say that again. I just want to hear if you heard any kind of commonalities, patterns, or similarities in terms of the feedback that you thought were really key criteria in terms of whether or not the proposal was fine. I know I've heard some stuff, but I'd like to hear what
I feel like the one you previously say, why should I know this? Like for the broader audience is actually really helpful because I didn't like have an idea of like how my research should why people should know my research. So I think that is a part that I couldn't get a grant if there is a grant. Yeah, but I feel that is also the one that because Shakita also say that part, and then that is also the key part that I feel like I could give her the grant. So
So the wider kinds of uses or applications.
Yeah, because that would actually focusing like how they be useful for the broader audience. Yeah.
What else?
I would say definitely, I think building off from what you had said, we had really similar, some of those similar ideas as well. Whereas I think when Maya provided the background on Maya's research, there was, she talked a lot about what's at stake, which was really helpful. And I thought perhaps if there was a way to get at why should people, why should the public or anybody else care about this work, really building a case there, I thought that would support the argument overall, or that would support the story over, or build the arc of the story about magic.
Sure, sure.
So we talked a little bit about that.
So again, the larger purposes as well as the stakes. What are the consequences, of this? So
Yes.
Financial consequences. I think you heard your, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars are lost or invested in a graduate student, and if they don't complete, then that's hundreds of thousands of dollars that are just lost, as well as the human costs and the human toll, right? Of having to suffer the alienation, the isolation, that sort of thing.
That's one.
Because you cannot put a dollar.
That's what, yeah. The emotional.
Or you can put a dollar figure on that about the therapy costs and all these things.
That too. That's true. You're right. That there.
So, okay. So what I want to now talk about are some ways in which to frame or to hang your kind of research and story. So I'll just come up with 3 that are very common to use. So the first is the problem solution benefit. Okay. And it's basically, what is the problem? Okay. And to start off with that. Okay. And then the solution. What is your research? And how does it propose to solve this problem? And then finally, benefits. What are the benefits of your approach? Right. And why is it better than other approaches that have been tried before? Okay. So thinking about your approach in terms of problem, here we have, you could say leaky pipeline. You could say issues of, say, underachievement or what have you, dropout, lack of representation for certain demographics, right? That's the problem. Solution is cooperative learning. What are the benefits of that? Well, you could say it doesn't cost a lot of money in the sense of you're not adding more technology, with some perhaps changes in teaching style. It won't be a significant cost in terms of effort for the instructor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So again, thinking about what the problem is that you're trying to address, what is your solution in terms of your research suggests, and what are the benefits in terms of your approach? What does it have? What are the benefits that your approach has over comparable approaches? Okay. All right. Another common kind of structure is the detective story, the crime, mystery. So crime has been committed. We know we have a body, or so to speak. How did it happen? How was this person killed? Why was this person murdered? What are the possible suspects, motives, all these other kinds of things? And so in some ways, you have this mystery in front of you, and you're trying to solve it. And it may very well be in terms of the kinds of approaches you take, the sort of false paths that you've tried or you suspect, but you've had to kind of, in some ways, puzzle through. And so it's all about thinking about how do you gather or marshal evidence and thinking about the likely suspects to solve this crime. Okay. So again, you had this mystery and you're in some ways the detective and you try to solve it. Okay. And this goes back to the kind of story that I told earlier on. You already know the what in some ways. The person's dead,
Right.
but it's the how and the why that this happened, right? And then the other kind of structure that's often common is commonly used is the quest, which is in some ways a kind of a journey to obtain something or to achieve a particular goal. Okay. So there, to put this in kind of another context, some people have said there are three kinds of laws, so to speak, about the quest. So the task, the journey must be very hard, easy to understand, and a great deal must hang on its outcome. This is often easier said than done in terms of trying to think about your work, but again, you can frame it in terms of, while your story, for example, your story about education and educational kinds of strategies, different kind of pedagogical strategies. You can frame it along the story of a single individual who's teaching the course and who's trying to come out with, say, you know, I have this group, you know, I want to solve this problem, framing it that way. So it can be helpful to, in some ways, personify the problem, right? And so in your case, Shikita, Kubiri will be a principal, so to speak, and they're facing a similar kind of situation. Right? So, okay. So these are just three of, you know, many, many different kinds of structures. But I think they're the most, in some ways, amenable to talking about research. All right, so I want to move now to the AAA versus ABT, okay? And the AAA approach was from this, this is taken from this book called Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science Needs a Story. So this person was faculty member at University of New Hampshire, I believe, and decided to give it all up, give tenure up, and become a screenwriter. And so he struck out for Hollywood, and he did it. He became a screenwriter, produced a couple of science documentaries, and now kind of travels the country serving as a consultant for science communication. But he came out with this sort of frameworks. And the AAA approach is basically what we talked a little bit earlier about the and, okay? So it's this endless string of facts, okay? And he contrasts that with the ABT approach, the and, but, therefore, okay? And so, talking a little bit about this, okay? So the difference between the and approach and the and, but, therefore approach is that, as you can see, it starts out with the and. So you have a series of facts, right? And that's just basically the setup, the context, the introduction. And again, this is almost like a lit review, right? The and, okay? But the key is that you have this thing called the but, this reversal of direction. So the but is basically the conflict, right? What is the complication? What is the problem? What is the question that emerges that needs to be resolved, answered, addressed? And this is in some ways the reason for the story, okay? And then finally, that wraps up with the therefore, which is basically what's the point? What are the consequences? What's at stake? And what this does, again, is that it sets up, in some ways, tension. Because you have the and, right? Kind of like the setup. But that but introduces that complication, right? The tension, okay? So people have been teaching this way for years, and, or schools have imposed, you know, have existed for years, and. But something changes. There's difference, right? And so what's the difference? And then therefore, what happens next? What are the consequences of that? How is it solved? Okay? So any story, in order for it to be a story, needs change. And so this is why oftentimes people find it difficult in terms of talking about their research and making it into a story, is that there's no change. I mean, you get stuck in the and loop. And. It just keeps going on.
Yeah.
But when you have the but and the therefore, again, you have this complications, problems, issues, question that needs to be resolved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the key, that's the turning point, okay? And then again, the therefore just brings up the stakes, what's involved. What is, why should this matter to the larger population, right? Who cares, okay? So, he gives this example of the ABT with a common sort of story of this. And of course, those are costs. Okay. So again, in a typical story, nothing would happen. There's no change. There's stasis. There's just blah in that and. But you have this kind of precipitating moment, right? And then the therefore again is what happens next. It's that kind of time machine. Okay. Right. Questions about that, the ABTs. I'll give you a chance to sort of work on this a little bit further. Does it make sense, folks?
I'm wondering, in the structure of thinking through storytelling too, do you want to create, when you're talking about your research, like characters around, like the character of the little girl, or the character of the school, or the character of the classroom? Like, is that helpful too?
It certainly can be in terms of investing something that's oftentimes abstract into more concrete terms. And so when you're talking about pedagogy, what does that look like? Or teachers, what does that look like? But if you can give, and we'll talk a little bit about this later in terms of making it concrete, making it personified, so that people can actually see like, oh yeah, I see what that looks like, right? Because otherwise, when you talk about racism or capitalism, it's just like these kind of concepts that are like, what does that look like? What is that mean?
Yeah.
Right. So.
Well, in this particular example, and I think perhaps a lot of our research is looking at that, right? The life that is boring.
Yes.
It's not that there's, so in this case, the tornado comes from somewhere else, right? The tornado comes from the outside. Whereas and then, so in the but is where you're introducing the problem, right? But the problem is not the tornado in a lot of our work, it's the life that is boring, right?
That's a good point. But why, then the question you have to ask yourself is, why are you doing your research?
Yeah.
I mean, it may sound really kind of basic, like if it's always stuck in the ad,
Yeah.
so what?
Right.
There's no problem. So what are you looking at? What are you investigating? I mean, it sounds, I mean, I don't mean to make light of your situation, but you know, it's there, but you're just not thinking about it in those terms. So again, to take your example, it's like people have been teaching the same way for years and years and years and years and years. Why should we change? Right?
That's right. So like, for example, in that case, like problems have come to light that were previously left unaddressed.
Yes, exactly. Right. Exactly.
So that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is something didn't come from the outside. It always was there.
It was there. Exactly. Yes.
That was the point.
So I guess in this sense, it doesn't have to be an external force, right? But there has to be a reason to move the story, or a reason for the change, right? And so what I'm suggesting is that whether that's external in terms of tornado, like act of God that just comes down and just wipes out everything, or whether that's an inherent problem in the system, like capitalism. I mean, you'll always have, according to Marx, exploitation, no matter what happens, right? You'll always have that surplus labor value. I mean, it's just there. You can't get out of it. It's always exploitation. So, okay. All right. So, so getting back to this made to stick thing. So there are basically these kinds of principles that they talk about, and they spell success. Okay, but we've already kind of addressed the sort of simple, and by the simple, thinking about again the purpose of your research. Okay. And we've already talked a little bit about the structures, right? Terms of problem, solution, benefit, detective story, quest, and the AAA ABT. So I'd like to kind of revise this a bit by thinking about the simple, the stories that we've already addressed, and the story should contain the following: unexpected, concrete, credible, and emotional. All right. All right, so I'm going to breeze through these pretty quickly. So the unexpected, it's pretty basic. Breaking expectations and creating a hook. So these are just two principles that I want to bring up in terms of the unexpected. Okay, the idea behind unexpected is that you want to grab their attention, okay, and engage them quickly and immediately. Okay, because once you have their attention, then you can kind of move them around or direct their attention. Okay. And one of the easiest ways to sort of get attention is to create surprises, the unexpected, okay? However, there are oftentimes, how shall I say this? People have different expectations about different things, and you're wondering, so what expectations should I break? So here are just a few kind of like breakable expectations that they bring up and I bring up. So urban legends, so urban legend of alligators in the sewer system. Misconceptions, they could be kind of commonsensical, they could be based in science. So color red actually does not anger bulls. Bulls, I think, cannot see the colors red. And so it's actually the ocean that, you know, gets their attention. And finally, last stereotype, much as I would like it to be true, Asians are not always good at math. So the point of these is that people don't necessarily have, your audience doesn't have to necessarily believe in them, even like partially or even fully. They're just there, and they're almost what are considered examples to push up against. Okay. So again, the audience doesn't necessarily have to believe in them, but you're just kind of using that as a way to start. Okay. So thinking about breaking expectations. So what does your audience already know about your topic? How could you use that to surprise and engage them? So what is your, like if I were to ask you, what does your audience know about the topic? And it could be right things or wrong things. What do they know? Let's hear from folks.
You know, the schools are, there are some schools that are failing.
Yeah, schools are failing. Not surprising. Right, and this is again the kind of, when you go back to the story where nothing happens, right? Nothing, I mean, but it's the how and the why, right? That's the real key of that. Right. What else? What else do people know about your topic? And it doesn't have to be right things or correct information. It could be just completely wrong stuff that's just in their minds. What do people know? What do you work on?
Sorry, I should introduce myself. Sorry, I'm late. My name is Vinay. I'm a master's student in choral conducting.
Okay.
And my topic is kind of exploring the music of the Malankara Orthodox Church. So there's it's one of the branches of Christianity in India. And so what do people know? I mean, people know that music is an integral part of worship. And so I'm trying to explore just different sound spaces and how singing versus speaking in different languages compared to the area affects people spiritually.
Okay. So people know that when you go to church, there's some kind of singing involved.
Yeah.
Right. It's pretty standard. You go to church, go to a place of worship. Most places of worship, churches of Christian, you sing. Okay. And so then the question is, what does that mean? Right? Does it mean that it's like, what do people get out of that singing together? Right? Because that's a different form of kind of communion, or not communion in that sense, but a different form of solidarity than it is to just listening. Right? So what does it mean? Right? So that could be, again, the kind of issue of the surprise, right? Because people, when they, and some people, they don't even sing.
Right.
So what are those folks getting out of it, right? And so thinking about, again, what are expectations, right, people have? And how could that surprise or engage them? That people who don't even sing or have terrible voices could be getting something a lot out of it, just even though they're terrible singers, right? And so it's thinking, again, what do people know about it? And how can you use that to break or surprise? Okay, great. Okay, second thing I want to bring up in terms of the unexpected is the hook. Okay, so creating that hook, you kind of want to lead with the unexpected. And so what I mean by the hook is that's the thing that starts things off, right? It hooks them in, it brings them into things, okay? You can also use that hook to, again, explain the stakes. Okay, what is involved? What are the consequences? And again, this could be getting back to the kind of therefore sort of thing. So oftentimes when people lead off, any kind of presentation or whatever to a general non-specialist audience, they'll bring some kind of statistic like cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in the world. It's like, oh, okay, now we should listen. This is why it's important, okay? So that can oftentimes bring people and engage them. The other way you can create that hook to engage people is to start in the moment. So I want to contrast, I want to tell two different versions of the same story. So the first version of the story is, so here's, I always knew I wanted to be a doctor when I was a young child because I was always interested in like death and why things die and how things work. So I would ask my parents when we were driving to stop and look at roadkill because I was interested in seeing, like, why did that raccoon die? Oh, probably blunt force trauma, got hit by the car. And so I kind of nurtured this sort of interest and desire. I had, took AP Bio in high school and did well in that. Went to college, was pre-med, had a little difficulty with, say organic chemistry, but I overcame that difficulty and, eventually thrived. And so then I went to medical school, did different kinds of rotations, and really liked the energy and adrenaline kind of rush that I got from working in the emergency room. So one of my first patients was this woman who had been hit. She had been in a really bad car accident, and she was probably going to die if it had not been for me. And so again, this is why I knew that I really wanted to become a doctor, because I had, again, really wanted to help people and really wanted to help save lives. Okay, so that's a kind of story that's not really that engaging because it's almost like the and. It's like this series of events that just kind of unfolds chronologically, and there's no kind of tension involved with that. So contrast this with another kind of approach of starting. So, 24-year-old woman had a hard time really even identifying that this person was a woman because her face was so badly bruised. She was suffering from multiple compound fractures, which meant that her bones were sticking out. She was badly, badly injured. In fact, she probably would have bled out in about 10 minutes had it not been for me. That was my first patient. Okay. So the contrast with the sort of unfolding it chronologically and basically starting with all of that kind of detail as the and versus the kind of starting in the moment is that I've just dropped you into the action. And you as the audience, you as the reader are kind of trying to make sense of what's happening, what's going on, okay? But you're immediately pulled in. And so it can very well be that you're creating that momentary confusion, but in that momentary confusion, you're grabbing the audience. Because the audience, the reader, they will never be as interested in what you have to say or what you're writing as it is in those opening lines or that opening minute. So if you unfold it in a kind of chronological, like this happened and this happened and this happened, you've lost their attention. You basically lost that opportunity to really draw them in. And so really think about how do you create that hook? How do you start the moment? How are you showing them the stakes? How are you leading with the unexpected to really draw them in the situation? Okay. And so that hook, once you have that hook, you know in some ways what the end is. Okay. So oftentimes people will have difficulty ending stories. They'll oftentimes tell the story, blah, 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 blah. And then they'll kind of like peter out or just kind of stop talking abruptly. And then people will kind of look at them and they'll sort of look at and like, are you done? And yeah, I'm done. And, okay, I'm done. And you can just kind of stop talking. So it's often kind of awkward, abrupt, that sort of thing, okay? However, once you have that hook, what you want to do is return to that hook at the very end. And that will in some ways signal to the audience, to the reader, that you're wrapping up. Because in some ways you've come full circle, okay? So if I were to say, so when I think about that first patient that I had, in your mind, you're already kind of thinking, oh yeah, he's wrapping up, okay? So it can be a really elegant way, in some ways, to show your reader, your listener, what have you, your audience, that you are in fact wrapping up. Okay. Questions about that? Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one, concrete. Okay, so concrete is pretty basic, just providing really specific concrete details within an accessible context, using analogies, and then including moments of reflection. So I'm just going to review these really quick, okay? So oftentimes we'll give facts or details or statistics like this. So movie popcorn has 60 grams of saturated fat, okay? Just facts, okay? Because they make sense to us and they're concrete details, and so we just want to give them people information, okay? But to the audience, the specialist audience, they're thinking 60 grams of, is that a lot or a little? Why was that, it's probably bad for you, but how bad is it, right? So framing it in terms of this larger context, right? So it's more accessible will help people make sense of this, okay? So again, making sure when you provide statistics, when you provide facts, you actually situate it in a really accessible context, okay? Other things, analogies, this is pretty basic. People use this a lot, but whenever you're talking about your work, especially if it's particularly technical, you want to give people analogies and use metaphors. So typical example is the enzyme. One of the mechanisms, the way it works is that it's a lock and key. Okay, right. So, and the reason this works is because we understand our prior knowledge, right? What we already know about a topic can help us learn new things. And so this is why things like metaphors and analogies work. And it can also be why, in some ways, that unexpected can also work really well, because whenever people have this prior knowledge and they realize, oh, it's incorrect, that can be surprising, right? Because it's unexpected. Okay. And then always, always, always in a story, making sure you have these moments of reflection or these kind of out moments. And they basically just explain why the facts matter or why what was just said or what you wrote is important. So you may say that people sing this song or sing these certain types of songs. And then if you move on to the next kind of thing, it's like, okay, he just said that there are certain songs. Why did you mention that they sing these songs, right? So they mean certain things, or the song itself is not important, right? But it could be the music or the feeling of community that it engenders or whatever, right? So again, it's just explaining why what you said is important. Because if you just have a series of facts, they're meaningful for you, but not necessarily for the listener or the audience, right? So this is kind of like why, in some ways, that story that I told about the person that wakes up and it's really, really quiet, eventually you're just going to kind of lose interest, because in the back of your mind, you're thinking, why is it so quiet? Why is this unusual, right? So again, thinking about just having these moments of reflection that kind of step out from the facts is really important. Okay. All right, credible. Okay. Credible is basically things that sound true or that have this kind of element of, I can't say truthiness, but insight. And the fact that you are actually experts in your field, anything you pretty much say is going to be from an expert position. But what you want to do is think about how do you bolster that kind of feeling in your audience, right? And so there are two ways you can do it. One is just some kind of external authority in terms of some governing independent body. And the other is just by personal experience, okay? And so I want to actually just give you an example of personal experience. And so what you're trying to do in some ways is give the listener, give the reader, give the audience, in some ways, just insight into what you do, okay? So what I'm gonna do is show you, I don't know why this is like this, dark. I wanna show you a short excerpt from a 3-minute thesis that was done a few months ago. And this should have audio, right, if it's hooked up to HDMI?
Yeah.
Okay.
The audio might not broadcast.
Okay. Okay. So let's and.
All right. As fast as you can, I want you to find the sideways letter T in the left half of this display. Pretty simple, right? It's there in the lower left corner. Now I want you to tap into your elementary school memories and find Waldo, that sly guy with the striped hat and glasses. That's a lot harder, but you probably found Waldo faster than you would have if you had looked for the T first. Why? Because Waldo appears in a similar part of his scene as the T that you found before, in the lower left corner. Now you may or may not have consciously made that connection, but after finding the T there, your brain noted that lower left is an important area, so you probably looked for Waldo there first. Whereas Waldo is a fun, playful game, but our speed and accuracy in finding things can have serious consequences if you miss something while driving, if a TSA agent misses a weapon on baggage screening, or a radiologist misses a tumor in an X-ray image. So can we train TSA agents, radiologists, and all of you to automatically look in the important places first, like you did with Waldo? My research suggests that we can. Even though our visual world is complex, a lot of important things tend to appear in similar places repeatedly. Radiologists know that certain kinds of tumors cluster in certain areas, and you probably know where the problematic intersections are in your drive to work.
Again, you're just giving people that personal experience of like, oh yeah, this is kind of like the work, this is the work that she does in terms of, you know, testing for visual cues. So again, what kind of insights could you provide to your readers, audience, listeners, what have you, okay? And it could very well be that personal, kind of almost a rhetorical question that you're asking. All right. So again, how could you give the audiences an authentic example of your research? What is something unusual or interesting? How did you arrive at it? What common examples can you provide about how the flow has changed? So, what are your thoughts? Just so you viewers at home know that they're still thinking. Well, maybe something will come. Emotional, okay. So this is pretty straightforward. Right. And it's something we talked a little bit earlier about in terms of thinking of the ways in which, what are the stakes, what are the consequences. And so example of this, I'd like to show another 3-minute thesis presentation a couple of years ago. And let's move this, whoops. Back. Again.
We all have to take medicines at some point in our lives, whether it is that life-saving cancer treatment or the vitamins you take daily. The most preferred way of taking your medicine is to take it orally. Now, when you swallow a medicine in the form of a pill or a capsule, the first thing that should happen is that it should dissolve in your stomach fluids. And once it's dissolved in the stomach, it should be able to cross your stomach membranes and get into your bloodstream. Unfortunately, about 90% of medicines currently being developed cannot dissolve in the stomach fluids, which means, for example, they'll have to be given as injections. But just like this woman over here, we all do not like injections. And so there must be ways to increase the ability of these compounds to dissolve in the stomach fluids so that we can make them into oral dosage forms.
Kind of using that emotional appeal, right? The fear, the anxiety of shots, right? Although 90%, again, of drugs currently administered have to be done intravenously as opposed to, okay? So again, the kind of stakes, repercussions, and just the pain of getting shot, right? Negative implications. So thinking about the emotional, particularly strong feelings, emotions, does your audience have about your topic? Yeah. know what I could do is just pair you up and talk in your small groups, report back. That's a common strategy for teaching, but I just wanted to see if there are any initial thoughts.
I have a quick question. Is that like emotional and incredible songs both like given out an example that could make the audience have like similar thoughts? I was wondering like what is the difference between them, or they are actually like similar but like different strategy?
Okay, sure. So it's a good question. So thinking about what is the difference between credible as between that and emotion. In some ways, there may very well be overlaps, right? Because things that are believed by people, they have an emotional reaction. Like, so for example, if we go back to this one, right? It's like that kind of like, here's the T, here's Waldo. It's like, oh yeah, I got it. It's like that insight, that surprise. And so that's an emotional reaction. But you're also letting people experience it for themselves, that personal experience. So that's like, oh yeah. So I'm not saying that, in some ways it's not quite helpful to say that, it's one or the other. There's often overlap, right? And what the authors of the book, Chip and Dan Heath, do talk about is that the more the better. And so the categories, because they're not discrete categories, like totally separate, as long as you kind of think about how you might incorporate some of these kind of different principles or elements, that's better. So again, these are just kind of principles that you think about. So, good question. Yes.
I was going to say that for me, like most of these, the emotional ones strikes me as being really, really important, especially in the context of kind of like how we're typically taught to write academic writing, that often is, it's not really always privileged to put strong feelings and emotions into your writing. And so I think there's kind of also a little bit of like a switch that your brain has to do to take yourself out of the way you've been trained to write for academia in some disciplines, to have that component. But I feel like if you don't have the emotional component in a story, then like if you don't care about the characters in the story, if you don't care what happens to them, then you don't care at all.
Yeah, what's the point? Like, yeah, so this is where that issue of stakes, right? What is at stake? What is it? That can often bring people to it. But I'm so glad you brought that up in terms of having emotion not be a part of academic writing, right? You're supposed to be distant. You're supposed to be treating it at kind of arm's length, because that's what it means to be unbiased. That's what it means to be rigorous. If you're too close to it, you're not neutral. You're not academic. You're not looking at it with a critical eye, right? But in some ways, you want that kind of perspective when you're trying to make that connection with another person who's a non-specialist, right? Why should they care? I mean, that whole notion of why should you care is emotional. and to separate it out, it's just like, wow. So again, this is one of those kind of issues of like, do you have these, you have these kind of success kind of things, these principles, but there's a lot of overlap, right? There's a lot of overlap. So again, thinking about this whole thing about why people should care is a huge part of any kind of story. What it states, what's important.
I mean, I was even thinking with the analogy that you brought up from 3-minute thesis, like even using those two examples as analogies, like for me, had kind of an emotional draw to it, just because like I did grow up like reading Where's Waldo books, and I show those books to like my kids, and like in a way like that, those images that were used as part of it were really strong for me and nostalgic. Even the T's looked like Tetris, which I'm sure was intentional too.
Yeah. But they're very evocative. And just the whole thing about, again, what is at stake with the Where's Waldo? Well, baggage screeners, TSA, possible terrorist bomb kinds of things, cancer diagnosis, radiation oncology. It's like, oh, right? Intersections, like car accidents, things like that. So again, the stakes bring in that emotional kind of component core. Okay? But this is just helpful in terms of thinking about what kinds of details, what kind of elements could you add to, in some ways, increase the level of engagement in your stories.
The other thing that I was just thinking of is just sort of like, how do you untrain your brain to tell a story that isn't super complicated? Like even the whole simple part, right? Like we're trained as graduate students to be as complicated as we possibly can. I mean, I felt like that when, you know. So even being able to step back and like make it simple is a challenge.
Yeah, that's right. But again, if you, and it may very well be that whole thing of like, the purpose of my research is,
right.
You know, what could people do with your research in 10, 20 years? So, I mean, and it can be, you know, incredibly reductive, but it's also, you know, some people say, is it dumbing down? Is it being too reductive? But in some ways, it's just prioritizing, because again, you can come out with a string of facts all day long about your topic, but it's not going to be meaningful because they don't have the time, patience, or understanding to make sense of all those facts. And so you're going to prioritize what are the 2 to 3 most important facts that I want to get across. And once I have those facts in my mind, how can I wrap that around the story that has these kinds of elements? Yes.
So kind of in my research now, the hope is that this culminates into a master's thesis, which I have, and I'm in the first year of my 2-year program. And I'm kind of speaking with the professor on my research, and I'm telling him, you know, I'm exploring this music, and I find themes within these religious spaces that I want to explore, but I don't necessarily know the argument. And at least what this professor said was, in my research, that was the thing that came at the end. You know, and I've heard professors say different things, but could you, I don't know if you have experience or you heard different perspectives, because we're talking now about what's the point. Well, I don't necessarily know the point for a time until I find out more, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a good question, because so that's the difference in some ways between the kind of academic audience and the kind of lay audience or non-specialist audience. Non-specialist audience would just, like, they'd be really happy to hear the insights that you have to hear about, like, oh, people get meaning even though they don't sing. What's the point? Why do we have these songs if they're not singing? You know? So people would be interested to hear that. You know, and that, again, that's not part of an argument, though, right, that you're making. So I guess it's that whole thing about, you know, the difference between an academic context and a lay context or a non-specialist context. And you know that. You know, in terms of your arguments, that's a tough one, because you know, it gets down to whole kinds of things of what can you contribute, what contribution are you making to your field, and that's a hard one. You know, people are still, you know, academics who've been in the field for years, you know, they are constantly thinking, like, what's my next project? You know, what do I have to contribute to the field?
I'm wondering if you can talk, I mean, I thought the visuals that you had were really nice. And I'm wondering if you can talk about, like, maybe how you would use visuals to help tell your story.
Sure.
Or even like if you're doing, so using visuals, but also like how you might switch something based on, like, if you're writing a story or talking about your research, and maybe instead doing like a podcast or.
So that's a good question. How do you use visuals and how do they change or the meanings change? Or the supplements, let's just say supplement kinds of information. Supplements meaning visual supplements or audio supplements, like that. How do those change? So that's a good question. And then you're also getting the context of like, say, 3-minute thesis where you have just one visual, which is like hard because it's like, oftentimes in the 3-minute thesis, people just pack a lot of different things into one slide, hoping that people will follow along in the different kinds of things. And that's oftentimes problematic, just even from a kind of standpoint of like directional kinds of things. So people may say, so look at the image on your left, on the left. And like, is it my left, like this, or is it your left? So that can cause some kind of confusion as well. You know, generally for visuals, try to keep them simple in terms of 1 to 2, and what are called almost full bleed images, meaning that they take up the whole kind of picture. So they have this really dramatic sort of impact. The thing you kind of have to be careful about is that when they say that a picture tells 1,000 words, right, or says 1,000 words, like, are those the words you really want? So to keep in mind that sometimes the visual may not be the visual, tell the story that you want. In some ways that can be good because that can lead to the unexpected, right? So it's kind of like what's called the bait and switch. They look at something and they think they're looking at something, but it's really not what they're looking at. Or it could very well cause a kind of, you know, curiosity, so to speak, and you're drawing them in that way. You know, and that can be helpful for 3-minute thesis or to start a presentation, right? You have an image. What am I looking at? I'm wondering, you know, I bet they're going to tell me. So that can be helpful as well, you know, to start in the moment. I don't have much experience with podcasting, so I'm not quite sure in terms of how to use auto effects, sound effects to bring people in. It's a really hard kind of question to answer. So again, my experience is mostly through presentations and visual storytelling. But good question.
My other question would be, like I feel when we're also trained to write our dissertations and whatnot, we're thinking like, and this is true for 3-minute thesis too. It's like, you know, when we're trained to write our dissertations, we're trained to write like 200 or 300 page dissertations. So then, like, how do what are the strategies for cutting and making the story like fit within the parameters of what that story or container will allow? So like the container here being like 3 minutes, but if you're writing something for a broader audience and it's, you know, only like 2 pages, or like how do you decide how to make that story sing by cutting out? Like how do you decide what to cut?
So the advice is to edit ruthlessly. You know, the whole thing of kill your darlings, murder your darlings. So you have oftentimes a very kind of emotional attachment, like, oh, I spent so much time on this, writing this or thinking about this, I have to include it. It's oftentimes the way people in their dissertation defenses may, especially in the sciences, they have a chart or a graph or a table that represents 3 years of work. And it's there on the screen, and it's incredibly complex. You're looking at the legend and you can't understand what are the key, like what is going on here? And it's just this dense like thing. And it's just like, I have to have this because this represents my research. And yeah, it probably represents your research, but do you need it in that level of density, in that level of complexity? Because only you probably can read that and understand and make sense of that. The person who's looking at it the first time is just like, oh, huh? Like, do you need that, you know, time sequence in that to show that all of the results? Probably not. You can focus on just a short, section on that, which is key to your work. And so, but people feel that they have this emotional investment in it. And it's hard because the only way, in some ways, that you're going to be able to get that distance is to try it on different people. And it's like, it's hard to know. So I can kind of give you this example of that I've done in the past. It's a joke. So there's a grasshopper, and the grasshopper hadn't had anything to drink in about 28 days, which in the life of a mature grasshopper is quite long, because grasshoppers' lifespans, are usually about 64 days. So it's quite a distant length of time that it had not had anything to drink. So it was very, very thirsty. And so fortunately, it had come upon a bar. And so it walked down the bar, it's a basement bar, went inside and noticed the bar was dimly lit. And one of the reasons it was dimly lit is because it was a basement bar and the windows weren't very clean. But another reason why it was dimly lit was because a number of the lights had burnt out, and the grasshopper looked up and noticed that the lights were of the incandescent type. And so it made a mental note to itself to tell the proprietor of the bar to change those to either compact fluorescent bulbs or LED bulbs. Although LED bulbs, while they were more expensive, the prices have been coming down, and they're available in a variety of different kinds of hues and shades, and they would cast in some ways much more natural light, versus the CF bulbs, which had this kind of flickering aspect to it, which would also tend to cast a less flattering hue on individuals. But the grasshopper thought to itself, well, they would probably bring these up to the proprietor of the bar and let them know about the pros and cons and drawbacks of CF versus LED bulbs. But again, remembering that it was very thirsty, continued on. Noticed a curious smell in the bar, which was a unique combination of stale beer, urine, and vomit. But because, again, the grasshopper was very thirsty, continued on. Looked around, noticed some of the patrons were very poorly dressed and some were very well dressed. In fact, there was a woman at the bar. She had no shoes on, but she had a beautiful evening gown and an immaculate pedicure and manicure. And the grasshopper, being a connoisseur of pedicures and manicures, made a mental note to itself to ask this woman where she got her pedicures and manicures. But again, remember, it was thirsty, continued on. As it continued on, noticed that there were a variety of choice of stools on which to sit, some of which were three-legged and some of which were four-legged. And then the grasshopper, knowing that three-legged stools are inherently more stable than four-legged stools, chose to sit on the three-legged stool because the floor was buckling, perhaps through age and maltreatment. But anyway, grasshopper sat down, and indeed the stool did not rock because it was a three-legged stool. Grasshopper looked at the bartender returned the gaze of the grasshopper, and bartender said to the grasshopper, we have a drink named after you. Grasshopper paused, looked off in the distance, put the appendage on what could be considered its chin, returned the gaze of the bartender and said, really, you have a drink named Percy. So I totally killed that joke, knowing that I've gotten no kind of chuckles or anything like that. And part of the reason I totally killed that joke was because I added so much detail and so much kind of moments of reflection with something I mentioned earlier. Basically about the difference between LED bulbs versus CF bulbs. Grasshoppers don't even have fingernails, they have exoskeletons. So all these kinds of details, but you were kind of wondering, like, how does this relate, right? I know this must be somewhat important because he's bringing it up, but it had nothing to do with it at all, right? So in a joke, everything has to contribute to the punchline. If it doesn't contribute to the punchline, then it's got to go. So I basically took a 3-line joke. Grasshopper walks into a bar. Bartender says to the grasshopper, we have a drink named after you. Grasshopper says, really, you have a drink named Percy. 3-line joke. And I turned it into about 5 to 6 minutes of exposition. And so thinking about what is really important in your piece, whether it's a podcast, whether it's a 3-minute thesis, the container is 3-minute thesis, and you're hard and fast parameters in that. if it doesn't contribute to the punchline or what your, the purpose of my research is, fill in the blank, it's got to go. I mean, you may have some beautiful concrete details, but if they don't really contribute to the punchline for that message, then it's got to go.
Can you talk back about like the quest aspect?
Sure. So the quest, it's like a journey. It's like some kind of pursuit of something. So it can be, in your case, pursuit of a good education. I want my kid to go to a good school. I want my kid to get a good education, right? But, and to say the and the but the school is closing. Therefore, the community bonds that we had in terms of, what we built are being lost, or being thrown away. So how do we resolve, or how do we address some of these conditions? So it's not perhaps the best ABT kind of format, but it's thinking about like, somebody wants something, but there's an obstacle, like preventing that person from getting what they want, right? So again, it's that quest. And so I want something, I can't get it. How do I get it? And so the story becomes, how do I get what I want? Do I get what I want? When I get it, do I still want it? So in the case of like your situation, the principal or the school superintendent, I want to give these kids a good education, but I can't because of declining resources, right? So can I do that? Well, I can do that by closing schools. Did I get what I wanted? No. Oh, that's a surprise. That's unexpected, right? So it's, the quest is in some ways a distillation of like, I want something, I can't have it. So, but I really, really want it. And I think it's going to be really, really important and really, really good and valuable for a lot of other people around me. So how do I get it? So what are the obstacles? How do I problem solve around these obstacles? How do I overcome these obstacles? How do I overcome the obstacles?
I was just thinking about like the role of the narrator, like in storytelling, versus being the audience, the one listening to the story. And as a narrator, where you put yourself in your story, or do you have any suggestions? Or
Yeah, it's a hard one. So, so just to bring up the quest thing, it's like, who are you in the quest? Like, who are you, the kind of just observer, like the narrator, so to speak? And you're looking at the principal who wants this thing, who wants a good education for the kids in this community, whatever. Or are you the parent, or is the story told from the perspective of the parent who wants a good education for their kid? It's hard to know. It's a tough question to ask about where you should be in your story. Or it could be like I am the hero of my story. Like I am the researcher trying to cure cancer, or I am, trying to come up with this new therapy. It's hard to know what the ideal situation would be. And it may very well come down to like in what position can I have the sort of most unexpected or tell the most engaging type of story? I don't know. So in some ways, I think thinking about the surprise or what is unexpected can oftentimes drive the story or drive the narrative. Like, what is most surprising about the research that you're doing? So where do the big surprises come from? And from whose perspective is that surprise? Because it's that whole change. Yeah, because we always want to see change. Because stories are inherently about change. Because a story that's not about change is no story at all. It's just like nothing happens. So you need some kind of change. And so the unexpected is that can be that change. Because, in some ways, it's said that for, anytime somebody's like goes to like a lecture, present, or whatever it is, read a story, most people want to do one of two things. They want to have a good time and they want to learn something. Okay. Ideally, it's both. Like you read something and you listen to like, oh, that's really interesting. Oh, I learned something too. A good time and, both. And so learning is fundamentally about change, right? You think one thing and then you hear something, listen to it, read something, and it's like after that, it's like, oh, I think differently about it. I mean, that's fundamentally change, right? And so, one way to think about it is like, where, again, do you get this unexpected? Because that, built into it, the unexpected is fundamentally about change, right? So where can I get that surprise? That, aha. Should we stop recording? Be off the record? Should I just hit the...
I can take care of it a little bit later.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yes, what you do right now is you should just email me the presentation, and then I'll have both your emails so I can send you the video, and I can pull the audio from those videos.